Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about Module 7.2, language. Well, we all use language. But the question is, what is language? Well, you can think of language as a system of communication between individuals in a specific community. A system of communication that uses sounds. So when you talk to someone, you're using sounds and you're conveying meaning and communicating via sound. So you can say language is a system of communication via sounds. But is it only via sounds? Are there other ways of communication? Well, there are signs. American Sign Language is a valid system of communication. In other words, it's a language too. So you can generally define language as a system of communication via symbols. The symbols can take the form of sounds, signs. What makes a symbol specific and unique is what it represents. A symbol at a very basic level is a representation of objects in the real world or events in the real world. So alphabet A is represented with this sign. Or take the example of a coffee mug. A coffee mug in the real world is represented by a symbol, mug or coffee mug. A symbol is a representation of the object in our mind. An important point here is a connection between the actual object in the real world and its representation is arbitrary. Arbitrary here means that it is random. There is no real connection between the actual object, coffee mug, and the symbol we have allotted to that coffee mug itself. So language then is a system of communication via symbols, and a symbol is a representation of an object in the real world or an event in the real world or an idea in the real world. So it's a system of communication via symbols. It is not just a system of communication via symbols, but a system with rules to combine these symbols. And these rules of combining symbols is at various levels. And we'll talk about these various levels, various components of language. I just wanted to briefly define what language is before we move on to talk about the specific components of language. So language is a system of communication via symbols and a system with rules to combine these symbols at various levels. At a very general level then, we refer to these rules as grammar. Now, I'm not specifically referring to the grammar that you're used to, which is at the sentence level, but grammar refers to language at all the possible levels, and we'll talk about that levels in a second. And if you think about it, all known valid human languages, mostly they are spoken at least, are the languages that have some symbols, and there are some specific rules of combining symbols. For example, English language has specific symbols, and there are rules of combining them. Spanish language may have different set of symbols and have different rules of combining them. Sign language, for example, has a different set of symbols, and it has different rules of combining symbols. So language at a general level then is a system of communication via symbols with rules to combine these symbols. And the rules are generally referred to as grammar. So the outcome for this video would be to talk about the components of language, then talk about how we acquire language or how we learn a language. Then we'll talk about the connection between language and thinking. Then we'll ponder upon this specific question: is language unique to humans? Let's first talk about the components of language. Well, we can study language at different levels. The most important levels that linguists and psycholinguists study language at are these. And when we talk about these levels, we're going to specifically talk about these different components. One is the phonetics, the other one is morphology, and the third one is syntax, and the fourth one is semantics. Now, each of these things are symbols in themselves, and there are rules of combining these. And it will make sense in a second, but we'll talk about these symbols starting from phonetics first. So the very basic symbol in English language or any known spoken language is a phoneme. And that makes the very basic component of language. And the study of phonemes is called phonetics, is the study of the sound. What is phoneme? A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound. Now, if you think of English language, what is the smallest unit of sound? Well, the smallest unit of sound is a phoneme. Can you think of an example of a phoneme? The alphabets, right? Well, there are two types of phonemes: consonants and vowels. You know what consonants are, you know what vowels are. These are two different kinds of simplest symbols, simplest sounds in English language. And there are different sets, different number of consonants, different number of vowels in different languages. That makes each language unique. But there is a lot of overlap between languages in the sense that most known languages have most of their symbols or phonemes similar. But there is also some unique differences in the sense that some languages use some phonemes that are not used in other languages. For instance, English language has the sound specific to V and a sound that is specific to W, V and WA. Other languages, for example, in some of the Indian languages, do not have two different phonemes for these two different sounds. So it's always V, it's not WA. So the idea here is that languages differ in the number and the kind of phonemes they have. And there are rules of combining phonemes too, in the sense that if you have a word like C-O-M-B, well, in English language, you don't pronounce it as comb. The B here is silent. So this is grammar at the level of phonemes, which is the basic level of English language. Or lamb, which is L-A-M-B, where you're not actually pronouncing the sound of the letter B. So again, languages have consonants and vowels, and they differ in what these consonants and vowels are and what the rules are of combining these vowels and consonants, in other words, phonemes. Well, this brings us to the next level of, or next component of English language or any language in general. It's morpheme. A morpheme is, and the study of morphemes is called morphology. A morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. It can be a single phoneme or a combination of phonemes. A combination that makes meaning. A meaning which is the simplest meaning, not a complex meaning. In other words, if you look at a word like pen, P-E-N, it's one single morpheme, which is a word, of course, but there is no, you cannot break the pen. In other words, you can break the pen, but you cannot break this symbol pen or this morpheme pen into individual meaningful units, because pen is the smallest unit and you further cannot divide it into individual components. So the smallest unit of meaning is morpheme. It can be a phoneme by itself or a combination of phonemes that means something. There are two kinds of morphemes. Morphemes like pen, can, dog, word. These are usually words and they carry the meaning by themselves. These are called content words. They don't need to be attached to other words to exhibit, to show the meaning. Because there are non-content words that carry the meaning but that do not convey meaning by themselves. Can you think of such morphemes? So content words are morphemes that carry meaning and express the meaning by themselves. But there are non-content words. Can you think of, did you come up with any examples? Well, if you did, the prefixes and suffixes like un, ed, s. Example for a prefix is un. When you add un to a word as a prefix, then it changes the meaning of it. When you add a suffix like ed to a word, it changes the nature of the verb. When you add the suffix s to a noun, it changes the quality of it, the number of it, changes it from being singular to plural. So pen, and you add an s, it becomes pens. Pen means a one object, and pens refer to multiple objects. So although these phonemes or combination of phonemes carry meaning by themselves, that's why they are called morphemes, they do not show the meaning by themselves. They need to be attached to other content words. So again, morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. They either convey the meaning by themselves, these are content words, or they express the meaning when they're connected to other content words, in which case the examples are prefixes and suffixes. So S is one example of a non-content word. So we looked at phonemes, morphemes. This would be followed by the syntax and then semantics. Now, before I talk about syntax and semantics, I would like to give you a general structure of English or any other known spoken or written languages. So the basic level is that of phonemes followed by morphemes. Now, morpheme is either a word by itself, or when it is combined with another morpheme, it becomes a word. So phonemes, morpheme, a word, and a combination of words will make a phrase, and a combination of phrases will make a clause. A clause by itself, for example, independent clause, or a combination of clauses will make a sentence. A combination of sentences will make a meaningful unit called paragraph. A combination or a set of such paragraphs would make a section, say, of a chapter. A combination of sub-chapters would make a book. A book would be a part of, say, a genre. A genre would be a part of a specific literature, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that language starts with some basic symbols, like more like phonemes, and they build up, and there are rules of combining these at all of these levels. And these rules refer to grammar. We refer to that as grammar. So grammar refers to rules of combining phonemes to form morphemes. They also refer to the rules of combining morphemes to form words, rules of combining words to form phrases, rules of combining phrases to form clauses, rules of combining clauses to form sentences, rules of combining sentences to form paragraphs, paragraphs to sections, sections to chapters, chapters to books, and so on and so forth. And all these are, again, symbols at various levels, starting from phoneme, morpheme, word, phrase, clause, sentence, paragraph, section, chapter, book, genre. These are all different symbols, if you think about it. So we talked about the two components of language, phonemes and morphemes. Now we'll move on to the third component, or third aspect, or third level of studying language. It's syntax. Syntax here refers to rules of the structure of language. Rules of the structure of the language. For instance, English language has the SVO structure. S here refers to the subject, V refers to the verb, and O refers to the object. For instance, if you look at a word like I kissed my baby, it has I is the subject, kissed is the verb, my baby is the object. Either you can have a direct object, indirect. Again, we're not talking about the specifics of whether the word requires or doesn't require an object, but typically it does, and some don't. But the structure of English language, at least, is SVA. Other languages may have other structures. In other words, they may have other syntactic rules. Well, I don't know of any other language, but I heard that Spanish language has a different structure to it. It's not SVO. And the last level is the semantics. Again, these are the four important levels of studying language, or the four important components of language. But there are more depending on whether you're a linguist or a psycholinguist. There are some levels. The psycholinguists study language at, these are additional levels. Anyways, coming back to semantics, the semantics refer to the rules of not the structure, but the content of the language. So if you look at this sentence, kissed I my baby, it has a verb, subject, and object structure. Kissed is the verb, I is the subject, my baby is the object. Well, so it is syntactically an incorrect sentence, or an incorrect utterance in English language, because it's not following the syntactic rule. The correct example would be, I kissed my baby, where the syntactically this is an accurate utterance. Let's look at another example. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Do you think this has an accurate syntactic structure? Can you identify the subject, verb, and object here? Well, if you look at it, the colorless green ideas would be the subject, sleep would be the verb. The furiously here is actually an adverb, which is actually adding additional information to this sleep. But you can see that it's subject, verb, object, direction. The structure follows the syntactic rule. But here is the question: does it mean anything? It doesn't mean anything. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So the point I'm trying to make here is that an utterance may make sense structurally, but it may not carry any meaning. The study of the meaning, in other words, the content of the utterance, is called semantics. So that brings us to the second outcome for the video: language acquisition. Here we'll talk about how we acquire language, how we learn a language. It implies to both the situations where you're born and your first language is one language, so it's first language acquisition. It may equally apply to, or we can also talk about, acquisition of second language. So when we think of language acquisition, one person that comes to our mind is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is a linguist, and he proposed that language is unique to humans. There are no other species on Earth that can learn a language like humans do. They may have other ways of communication, but they don't use the way we use language. And it boils down to the same idea of the ability to combine symbols, the ability to represent information as symbols, the ability to represent ideas as symbols, and the ability to learn the rules of combining these symbols, according to Chomsky, is unique to humans. And he proposed that we are hardwired, we are born with this ability to learn the language, any language. And he called that LAD, language acquisition device. Language acquisition device is our ability to learn language, and this is unique to humans, according to Chomsky. It is our ability to learn a language. Just like we have the ability to learn to walk, we have the ability to learn language. Now, if you think of language acquisition, right, we can talk about stages of language acquisition. By the way, that's my daughter. That was her first Thanksgiving, and she likes, you know what she likes. And that's why we have that dress for her. Anyways, so what is the first sound that we as humans make? Any guesses? Well, it's the cry. That's the first sound we make. And if you're talking about spoken languages, that's the first utterance, right? By 2 months, we start producing different kinds of sounds in addition to the cries. Of course, those are the most frequent ones. By 2 months, they start producing, we call cooing. They start cooing. They produce sounds like ooh. Can you think of any relevance to the symbols of language? To what level do you think these sounds can be attributed to? Do they sound like any specific phonemes? Well, those utterances can be compared to vowels, right? But of course, those are not specifically vowels. If you want to make some sense, it makes sense to think that those are vowels. Anyways, by 6 to 12 months, kids start producing, babies start babbling. Babbling refers to such sounds as da, 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 ma, ma, ta, ta, ba, ba, pa, pa. So these babbles are basically phonemes. In fact, if you think about it, it sounds like a combination of a consonant and a vowel. By 1 year, they start producing one-word phrases: dog, book, pen, cat, dada, right? By 18 months to 2, again, these are averages. Different individuals have different um, developmental stages, and they go through different milestones at different times. But on average, by 2 years, they start producing 2-word phrases. And by this time, they can recognize at least 50 objects. In other words, they have a vocabulary for 50 different unique objects. And something happens overnight after 2 years. And this happens quickly uh, um, um, in girls when compared to boys. Girls show early onset of milestones, including learning languages, when compared to boys for some reason. In fact, girls in general are found to learn to talk first and learn to walk first before boys. By 2 to 3 years, they produce complex speech. I mean, literally complex speech. Think about it. Something happens around this time when they wake up and they start talking, just talking and talking. It never ends. It's like some combinations of things open up, and they suddenly discover this ability to combine these 2-word phrases in multiple different ways that they start producing complex speech. They kind of figured out the principles, the logic, the rules of language. Well, in doing so, sometimes they make some mistakes, right? They overgeneralize the rules. So that's why you have kids at this age and sometimes even beyond. They make such errors as, for instance, what is that? They add ed to the past tense for any verb. So I don't know, I can't think of any. So this is the stage. By 2 to 3 years, they kind of start experimenting and producing complex speech. But here is one important point. Just because we have the ability to learn language doesn't mean that we learn language. Period. We learn language only if and when we are exposed to the environment. So this is where the nature and nurture distinction comes. In other words, we do have the genetic predisposition and ability to learn language, which is the nature part, but we do need nurture and environmental influences to learn a language. And because English-speaking nations kids are exposed to English language, both at home and in school, well, that's the first language they learn. And so also for other first languages in other cultures or countries. It's the effect, a combined effect of nature and nurture, genetics and environment. Well, this brings us to the third objective for this topic, language and thinking. What is the connection between language and thinking? Well, we know that thinking, we've defined thinking as a process of representing and combining representations. And we basically said these representations are anything, these are basically symbols, right? Language has symbols and rules of combining symbols, and thinking is a way of using these symbols. So there is definitely, there must be, it makes sense to think that these are related, right? But an important question is, what is the relationship between language and thinking? Does the language you speak influence or affect or determine your thought? So if you're an English speaker, you think in one way, and if you're a French speaker, you think differently. Well, Wolff was a linguist who actually proposed this idea. It's called Wolffian relativity hypothesis or linguistic relativity hypothesis. Well, according to this hypothesis, the language you speak determines your thought. Again, the language you speak determines your thought. It's like saying that if you are an English speaker, well, this is how you think, and this is how you perceive the world around you. So the logic behind this hypothesis was that, well, languages differ in the number of words they have for a concept. Some languages may not have a concept or a word for a concept. There could be some languages, for example, Chinese language, there is a word that you may not have any word for that in your language. Or English language may have a concept and a word for that, and other languages may not have any words for that concept. So given that languages differ in number of words they may have for concepts, the idea that Wolff proposed was that you cannot think beyond those words then. In other words, we can't perceive the world or think about the world beyond the words we have. Well, that sounds weird though, right? Well, the current view is that language is related to and may influence but not determine the thought. In other words, if you speak one language, it will not change the way you think, but it may influence how you think about a concept based on the cultural practices, but not because of the language itself. So the current view is that language may influence our thought and maybe related to our thought at some extent, but will never determine our thought. In fact, Roche in 1975 conducted a study where Roche looked at a tribe with only 2 words, or words for only 2 colors. So they have only 2 words for colors, and those 2 words are for 2 different colors. And yet this tribe physiologically were able to recognize other colors, not just the 2 colors they have words for, but also other colors. So language influences our thinking, but think about it. At what level? It influences our thinking at a very, and behavior at a very basic cultural level. In other words, different cultures may have different expressions, right? And those expressions are not because of the limitations imposed by language, but these is a result of the limitations expressed by the cultural practices in itself. Well, I'll get back to the same example here. The example of mom jokes, right? When I first came to the US, a friend of mine suddenly started saying, a graduate friend in my grad school, we were very close, and suddenly started saying, your mom is blah, 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 that blah, blah, blah. I got really offended by that. Well, later on, I learned what he meant, and that he really didn't mean what he said, but it's just a practice. Although I still don't understand why. I can understand the fact that it's not, he did not mean what he said. Again, well, do you see the difference in thinking here? Well, the difference in thinking is not because of different languages, but difference in languages, but because of the difference in the cultural practices. Well, I was so annoyed by this that I actually started creating a different set of jokes. I said, okay, if mom joke is blah, 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 blah thing, I have a structure for a dad joke. So for a while, I started using dad jokes and said, okay, your dad is so blah, blah, blah that he blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what happened? It worked for a while, then people they didn't like it. Well, maybe it has to do with beyond cultural practice. Maybe it has to do with gender stereotype. Anyway, so the idea here is that our thinking about construct does not necessarily rely on the language you speak, but the cultural practices may influence the constructs and words you may have for expressions. that in turn may have influence on how you think about specific things. Well, that brings us to the last point. Is language unique to humans? Think about it. Is it? Now, if you just define language as a system of communication via sounds, well, it kind of makes sense. Dolphins communicate, right? It seems like birds communicate, other animals communicate. But the question is this communication using sounds as symbols? If it uses sounds as symbols, then there should be a system of combining these symbols. Human language, or humans, the way humans use, at least spoken language, is by having these rules of combining symbols to get different symbols, which again can be combined at so many different levels, that the permutations and combinations of words and phrases and clauses has limitless opportunities to create limitless ideas. This is called productivity. The rules and the fact that we are using symbols gives us this unique opportunity to create new ideas, to preserve new ideas, to convey new ideas, to propagate new ideas. In that sense, language then is unique to humans. Well, I'm going to stop here. This brings us to the end of module 7.2. In fact, it would be an end to the chapter 7, where we talked about thinking and language. Thank you very much.